Our story begins with a prince who was once the most powerful in the great Song Empire, yet now, his father has banished him to the frontier, forbidden from returning to the capital. Even when assassins were sent to take his life, the emperor remained indifferent, all because the prince is blind and considered a useless waste, unable to cultivate. To the perfectionist Emperor Jinlong, Prince Weichen was his only flaw. He assumed he would spend the rest of his days waiting for death in silence. However, fate had other plans when he unexpectedly awakened the Thousand Paths system during his journey, gaining the Seeker's constitution on the very first day. By simply touching a blade, he can extract the very essence of the sword. The more famous the weapon, the greater the power he gains. We see him now, focusing his attention on a sword resting inside his carriage, a blade known as the Zhongwu. He feels the martial techniques of the sword's former masters surging through his mind until, after some time, the Zhongwu loses its luster and turns dull. The weapon has become nothing more than an ordinary blade, but as he takes a deep breath, he realizes his own swordsmanship has finally reached the first rank. Though it is only the first rank, from this day forward, he is no longer the useless prince the world believed him to be. Once he stabilizes the energy within his body, a guard outside the carriage calls out to inform him that they have arrived at the Sword Terrace. The city gates remain closed, a clear sign of disrespect. They are waiting for him to struggle out of the carriage because of his blindness. He is forced to grope his way down, and the moment his feet touch the ground, the gates finally creak open with a loud thud. Amidst the thunder of galloping hooves, a powerful voice rings out. Zhou Xiong, commander of the Sword Terrace, greets the prince. Despite his words, Zhou Xiong makes no move to dismount. Though Weichen cannot see the man, he can certainly feel the tension. Deep down, he understands the situation. A battle-hardened general would never truly bow his head to a blind man. Weichen tells him there is no need for such formalities, noting that while he is in charge of the terrace, he will still rely on the general's help. He keeps his posture humble, showing no sign of resentment. To be honest, he doesn't yet have the power to voice any complaints. Seeing that the prince isn't trying to use his status to intimidate him, Zhou Xiong's hostility softens slightly as he calls for an officer named Qingshan. He orders Qingshan to escort the prince inside and see to his needs, before cracking his whip and riding off with his men. As they walk, Qingshan explains the layout of the Sword Terrace, and after a short while, the two of them arrive at a quiet pavilion. Before we even get close, a sudden tremor ripples through his spirit, a clear sign that his Seeker's constitution is reacting to something nearby. Qingshan raises his hand to introduce the site, explaining that this is the Sword Pavilion, where the blades of fallen Great Song soldiers are enshrined. It also houses famous swords collected from across the world. The officer remarks that his greatest wish is to one day leave his own blade here. Qingshan lets out a dry chuckle, mockingly adding that he forgot the prince is blind and cannot actually see these legendary weapons. Weichen senses the lingering spirits of the battlefield, yet Qingshan's arrogance grows. Since arriving at the terrace, the prince has felt nothing but malice. The officer snaps, boasting that he fought alongside the first prince in countless battles and survived death more than a dozen times. He claims his rank and place in the pavilion were earned, unlike a useless, exiled prince who is forbidden from ever returning to the capital. He asks if Weichen still thinks he is safe inside a palace. At this moment, the reason for his hostility becomes perfectly clear. To a man like Qingshan, every royal besides the first prince is nothing more than an enemy to be despised. He states he won't be accompanying the prince any further, noting they will have plenty of time to deal with each other before walking away. Standing outside the pavilion, Weichen remains entirely unbothered by the threats. To be honest, he has much more important things on his mind. Others might believe his future is ruined by this exile, but they have no idea how much joy he feels standing before this specific building. Given his low standing in Emperor Jinlong's eyes, finding resources to grow would normally be impossible, but this pavilion changes everything. It holds an endless sea of famous swords, and in his eyes, or rather, his mind, each one is fuel for his own rising power. First, however, he must find his quarters. Though he cannot see the sky, he senses darkness falling and asks the locals for directions. The next morning, he performs his daily check-in with the system, and with a flick of his wrist, a medicinal pill appears in his palm. He swallows it, feeling a surge of true essence spread from his core to his limbs until the pill's energy is fully absorbed. He can feel his internal energy growing slightly stronger. Usually, these daily rewards consist of standard true essence pills. For something better, he will have to wait for the monthly rewards, or perhaps the rare treasure granted during the annual check-in. In fact, his Seeker's constitution was the result of a yearly reward. Now, with the medicine digested, he is ready to begin. Weichen finds a sword slave to guide him toward the pavilion, feeling the tremors within his body grow more intense with every single step. He can almost hear the whispers of countless blades surrounding him as the six-story structure of the sword pavilion finally comes into view. The higher one climbs, the more terrifying the sword intent becomes. He tries the 6th floor first, but the sheer pressure there is overwhelming. The aura makes it impossible to even get close, let alone consume the energy, so he eventually settles on the 3rd floor instead. Though the blades here aren't the most legendary, they are still extraordinary, and so, the terrace gains a supposedly depraved blind prince. Despite his blindness, he spends every waking moment observing the swords, doing absolutely nothing else with his time. Initially, the officials at the terrace worried this blind prince might try to seize power, and they had made many preparations to stop him. But as time passes, everyone seems to forget that a sixth prince even exists. Indeed, time flies when one is ignored. A full year vanishes in the blink of an eye, and we find Wei Chen standing firmly on the floor of the pavilion's 4th level. He has spent the last year absorbing the essence of the blades on the 3rd floor. Now, as darkness falls, he prepares to depart. The sword slaves guarding the entrance watch him pass with expressionless faces, though one of them eventually speaks up with a sneer. The slave wonders aloud what the blind prince is thinking, coming here every single day for a year, regardless of the wind or rain. He mockingly asks if the prince believes that simply staying here long enough will somehow teach him the way of the sword. Another slave frowns, suggesting that at least the prince is sincere. The first one snorts, asking if he's hoping to gain favor with a blind man. He reminds his companion that even if that useless blind man liked him, he could never help anyone get close to a real sword. Walking steadily in the distance, Wei Chen hears it all. They think he is ordinary, unaware he has already reached the 4th rank of martial arts. His blindness has made his hearing exceptionally sharp, but he doesn't care about their insults. To be honest, these slaves aren't worth his time. As the moon hangs high and the minutes tick away, he feels a surge of genuine excitement bubbling up inside him. Throughout this year, his daily check-ins mostly yielded standard items like true essence pills, which served him well enough. The monthly rewards provided much better treasures, but now, the time has finally come for the highly anticipated annual check-in. This moment is bound to bring a monumental change to his life. Finally, the time arrives, and the system congratulates him on obtaining the grand prize. With a human body, he now commands the power of ghosts and gods, and a massive, spectral presence suddenly manifests within his right hand. At the same time, a terrifying force emerges, followed by the haunting, ghostly shrieks that seem to fill the very palm of his hand. The energy finally merges into his right arm, and everything returns to a calm state, leaving Wei Chen to feel the raw power now coursing through him. Suddenly, tears begin to flow down his face. For the first time, he can actually see the world around him, even if only within a 3-meter radius. After so many years, he finally knows what it feels like to see, and yet, the power brought by this ghost hand is far more than just sight. He can now use the ghost hand's power to transform his own body. After 3 years of mourning and 1 year of exile, his patience has paid off. To hell with worldly riches and the Emperor of Datsong. He chooses the path of immortality, and the next day, he breaks his routine by skipping the pavilion. This is a first for him, but a servant soon arrives, announcing that General Chung invites the prince to attend the Grand Sword Festival. The moment this sword slave steps within 3 meters of him, Wei Chen clearly senses a thick, suffocating wave of killing intent. The slave's eyes are filled with a blunt, undisguised malice. After all, in his mind, he is merely looking at a helpless blind man. As the man closes the distance to 2 meters, his expression suddenly twists into a hideous, predatory snarl. With a roar, he thrusts his sword forward, but Wei Chen remains perfectly calm, using a mere slip of paper as a blade to execute the falling range strike. In an instant, sword light falls like rain and blood sprays like arrows. The second-rank slave stares back with utter disbelief. This prince is no weakling. He cannot fathom how this supposedly useless prince could kill him with a single strike. Even a 3rd-rank martial artist shouldn't be capable of this. As the light fades from the slave's eyes, he realizes with a bitter irony that the entire world has been deceived by this blind man. He dies full of regret, and news of the attempted assassination spreads through the grounds with surprising speed. In less than 15 minutes, General Chung Shan rushes to the scene, looking quite surprised as he stares down at the cooling corpse on the ground. The general notes that the attacker was a ranked martial artist, admitting he may have underestimated the 6th prince. Meanwhile, Wei Chen stares directly at him. With his heightened senses, Wei Chen can feel Chung Shan's overwhelming malice and the killing intent hidden deep beneath that thin veil of surprise. Reflecting on the day's events, we see that the assassination attempt was far too convenient. After all, the sword terrace is guarded by countless soldiers. How could a mere 2nd-rank martial artist slip past them so easily? Wei Chen realizes this, yet he chooses to keep his suspicions hidden for now. He remarks that the defense of the sword terrace is truly disappointing, expressing a cold hope that such a lapse in security never happens again. If the 6th prince of Datsong were to be targeted twice in such a sacred place, General Chung would likely find it impossible to explain himself. A murderous glint flashes in Chung Shan's eyes as his face darkens. He bows to Wei Chen's departing figure, promising the prince there won't be a next time. Leaving the sword washing pool, he finds he has lost the mood for wandering. Deep down, he knows being at the 4th rank is still far too weak. This time, the assassin was only a 2nd rank who had no idea Wei Chen had already stepped onto the path of true cultivation. The next attacker won't be such a weakling, especially since Chung Shan's shadow clearly looms over this entire incident. Knowing his current strength isn't enough to face the general, he returns to the pavilion and heads straight for the 4th floor. Everything seems peaceful at first, but the moment he picks up a specific sword, he suddenly senses a surge of spiritual energy. Taking a deep breath, he activates his Sword Seeker ability, and we see the surrounding spiritual forces lock onto him completely. However, a fiercely malevolent power soon rises to confront these forces, a power originating directly from his ghost hand. This allows him to devour sword chi, while simultaneously tempering his own sword shadow, and just like that, half a month passes by. The system soon congratulates him on obtaining the 6 Realms sword technique, which uses the body as a foundation to gain supreme power. Upon seeing the results of this monthly check-in, he lets out a long, weary sigh. While the 6 Realms technique is likely the strongest he has acquired so far, it possesses one truly fatal flaw. If his rate of progress cannot keep up with the speed at which it consumes his vitality, this technique will become a death sentence. To be honest, such a price is hardly worth paying, though he realizes the technique might still have its uses in the right moment. As night falls, we see him leave the pavilion once more, passing by the same sword slaves who remain on their eternal watch. These men will never escape their lowly status, but this time, Wei-Chin stops directly in front of one of them. That sword slave is the very same one who defended him before, and Wei-Chin notices the man is actually a rare genius of the sword. He asks if the man wants to escape his lowly status, offering him a chance if he kills the others. The slave looks up in shock. A sudden, fanatical light ignites in the slave's eyes, and a moment later, he lunges at his fellow slaves like a starving wolf. In less time than it takes for an incense stick to burn, only one man remains standing. Seeing this, Wei-Chin tosses him the 6 Realms technique. He declares that from this day on, the man's name is Shiluanu, born to live and die for him alone. Half a month passes. We see Shiluanu practicing with a simple iron sword. Though his training has been brief, his movements are already becoming quite formidable. Suddenly, the doors are kicked open as a group of armored soldiers rushes in, led by a visibly enraged Chung Shan. The general bellows, accusing the 6th prince of daring to commit murder within the pavilion. Wei-Chin cannot see him, but he hears the malice. Wei-Chin calmly reminds him that while he may not be his father's favorite, he is still a prince, questioning why the general cares about mere slaves. He wonders aloud if those slaves felt bold enough to mock a prince because General Chung himself had instructed them to do so. Chung Shan's expression shifts instantly. He came here to cause trouble, but a charge of treasonous disrespect is a weight he cannot carry. Even so, he has no intention of letting the matter drop, claiming that while insults are handled by law, the pavilion is a sacred place. He declares that the slave who committed the killings must die, giving a subtle, hidden signal to the guard standing beside him. Taking the hint, the guard draws his blade and thrusts it towards Shiluanu in a sudden, lethal strike meant to end things quickly. Shiluanu's pupils contract as he reacts with startling speed, his internal energy surging through his body to meet the threat. He swings his iron sword without a hint of hesitation, executing the 6 Realms technique with a raw, desperate perfection. Their forms blur and cross as both men collapse to the ground, but in the end, it is Shiluanu who grinds his teeth and stands. Blood flows steadily from a wound in his abdomen, yet Chung Shan's guard lies still, having drawn his very last breath. Seeing his man defeated, Chung Shan explodes in a fit of rage and draws his own sword, unleashing a strike with the force of a collapsing mountain. The general brings that overwhelming power down toward the wounded Shiluanu, and it is at this exact moment that Wei-Chin finally moves. A flash of crimson sword light suddenly erupts, shielding Shiluanu as a deafening metallic crash echoes through the air. Chung Shan's blade is stopped dead in its tracks. Wei-Chin coldly notes that the general is being quite bold, trying to kill his people. He argues that since the slave belongs to him, there is no issue with him killing. He asks if Chung Shan truly thinks he rules this pavilion alone. These words cause Chung Shan to calm down instantly, though the look he gives Wei-Chin is filled with an extreme, lingering threat. He had assumed that killing the previous assassin was mere luck, but he realizes now that this blind prince has actually reached the 4th rank. Taking a deep breath, the general turns and leaves, though the killing intent swirling in his heart has only grown more intense. It seems even when Wei-Chin tries to recruit a subordinate, others are desperate to snap his new claws. Fortunately, he acted in time. He knows the only path forward is to keep increasing his strength. As time passes in seclusion, his power continues to rise steadily. The range of his killing intent perception expands further and further. This feeling of being able to see even more of the world is the best possible motivation for his bitter cultivation. Within 6 months, his strength has already reached the formidable 6th rank. Previously, Chung Shan relied on his own 6th rank status to threaten him repeatedly, but now, the general is no longer a match for him. However, he realizes that looking for trouble now would only expose his strength too early and alert his other enemies. Yes, patience is key. Unfortunately, even when he wishes to practice in peace, there are always those who refuse to let him. Just then, Shiluanu enters the room. The subordinate reports that General Chung has sent word. Tomorrow is the great sword washing ceremony, and the prince is expected to preside. Shiluanu warns that this is surely a trap, but Wei Chen simply tells him to inform the messenger that he will attend on time. He runs his fingers along the 7-star Dragon Abyss sword, feeling the cold light shimmering off the blade. It was a beautiful, lethal thing. Since Chung Shan has targeted him time and time again, he decides it is finally time to eliminate this hidden threat once and for all. After all, one can be a thief for 1,000 days, but one cannot guard against a thief forever. The next morning, the reckoning begins. The low, long blast of a horn resounds across the sword pavilion as Wei Chen walks down the aisle, surrounded by a massive crowd. Thousands of sword slaves kneel upon the ground as Chung Shan bellows the order for them to take their blades and enter the washing pool. We see thousands of sword slaves carrying newly forged blades toward the water as a massive number of weapons enter the washing pool. Several slaves approach the prince with even finer weapons. They explain that those already in the pool were merely ordinary blades. These first-class treasures, however, must be personally delivered by the pavilion master. Wei Chen reminds them, quite reasonably, that he is blind. He suggests General Chung take over, but the general insists this is the master's duty and cannot be delegated to anyone else. If the prince finds it inconvenient, the general offers to have someone lead the way. Hearing this, Wei Chen simply lets out a soft, knowing chuckle. With a steady, confident stride, he begins walking toward the pool. Chung Shan watches him, a look of genuine surprise crossing his face. It is strange, after all, that a blind man requires no assistance and can walk with such perfect balance and poise. It is certainly unexpected, but the general tells himself that a blind man is still just a blind man with no hope of a future. After all, today is meant to be his final day, as Wei Chen leads the sword slaves toward the water's edge step by step. A cold, murderous glint flickers in the eyes of the slaves following behind him, just as the swords are about to enter the pool. Shiluanu is the first to react, shouting for the prince's protection as he draws his blade and unleashes the 6 Desires sword technique. His entire body is instantly enveloped in a crimson aura of blood chi, using his own life force as the foundation for his strike. With a sudden, violent explosion of power, Shiluanu manages to intercept one of the 4th-rank assassins. However, 3 others continue their charge toward Wei Chen, and the strongest among them has already reached the formidable 5th rank. The 5th-rank assassin's eyes burn with fanaticism as he swings his blade down, but in that same breath, the 7-star Dragon Abyss unsheaths. As the assassin's sword descends, Wei Chen meets it directly with the Dragon Abyss. The sound of snapping metal fills the air as the common blade breaks. The assassin's pupils shrink in utter disbelief, but to be honest, he is not given a single moment to process his failure. In the very next instant, his vision shifts as he sees his own body falling away. With the 5th-rank leader dead, the expressions of the remaining 2 4th-rank assassins turn pale with dread. Wei Chen does not hesitate and lunges toward them. In a display of movement as fluid as flowing water, both 4th-rank attackers are cut down and silenced forever. The final assassin and Shiluanu fought until both were severely wounded, ending an assassination attempt that Wei Chen handled with surprising ease. We see everyone at the washing pool frozen in place, staring in absolute shock at the sudden and violent turn of events. Chung Shan felt his entire body begin to tremble. A single strike had killed a 5th-rank expert, followed by 2 4th ranks. This was a level of power that even an ordinary 5th or 6th-rank warrior would likely find impossible to achieve. The 6th prince now possessed the strength to threaten his own life, and Chung Shan knew he had to kill him immediately. Shouting for the guards to protect the prince, the general charged toward Wei Chen, pretending to come to his rescue. He cut down the last wounded assassin and asked with sickening hypocrisy if the prince was unharmed. Yes, as if he cared. But in the next heartbeat, Chung Shan's expression twisted in fear as he saw Wei Chen lunging directly toward him, blade raised. In an instant, the sword moved like a soaring song, transforming into a streak of fire followed by a sharp, decisive sound. The 7-star Dragon Abyss had already pierced Chung Shan's throat. Wei Chen met the general's look of utter disbelief with cold indifference. He calmly withdrew his blade and announced to the crowd that Chung Shan had conspired with northern barbarians to commit treason. The general was executed on the spot for attempting to assassinate a prince, a sight that left the surrounding crowd paralyzed with terror. Everyone could see the assassins were linked to Chung Shan, but watching a high-ranking officer die in one strike was another matter entirely. Without another word to the onlookers, Wei Chen allowed Shiluanu to take his arm and lead him away from the washing pool. On the following day, we find our prince walking the familiar path toward the sword pavilion, just as he did every morning. However, the pervasive malice he used to sense was gone, replaced by the sudden, sharp crack of a horsewhip echoing nearby. He turned to ask Shiluanu what was happening, and after a brief, hesitant silence, his companion provided the grim answer. It seemed several guards from the sword terrace were drunkenly whipping the local commoners for their own amusement. Hearing this, Wei Chen simply nodded and began walking toward the sound of the lashes. To be honest, they should have stopped while they could. A man named Lu Shantong was swinging his whip with brutal force, while the peasants cried out in pain, too terrified to resist. Beside him lay a basket of overturned cabbages, clearly his only livelihood, while a guard sneered that the man had dared to block his path. The guard, Lu Shantong, laughed as he vowed to whip the man to death, but in that very moment, a cold flash of light shimmered. A blade sliced through his horsewhip instantly, a sight that caused the drunken group to sober up as Wei Chen asked if the sword terrace had no laws. He questioned if they thought being drunk excused their cruelty, prompting Lu Shantong to glare with eyes full of rage. He drew his long sword, mocking Wei Chen as a blind man who had killed his brother and still dared to come looking for trouble. He blustered about the sword terrace guards not being pushovers, though we see his blade wobbling and his stance looking rather unsteady. His companions tried to persuade him to put the sword away. Even though they all hated the prince, they weren't entirely without reason. They knew the consequences of attacking a prince in the street, while Wei Chen warned that the emperor would execute their entire families for such treason. Lu Shantong's face twisted as the alcohol fueled his temper, and for a moment, it looked as though he might actually strike. However, the others held him back, urging him not to be impulsive since General Zhou would be returning very soon. They assured him that General Zhou would handle the matter, and at the mention of Zhou Xiong, Lu Shantong finally began to calm down. He glared at the prince, warning him not to think the killings at the Sword Terrace would be forgotten so easily. He claimed that if the senior generals hadn't left for the border to face the northern barbarians, Zhou Xiong would have already punished him. With those parting words, the group turned and left, realizing that continuing the confrontation would bring them no benefit. As we watched them walk away, Wei Chen slowly shook his head, knowing full well that this matter was far from over. Despite being a prince who should have held immense power, his blindness had made him a target for constant humiliation. Everyone knew of Cheng Shan's repeated provocations, yet not a single soul had ever stepped forward to speak a word in the prince's defense. Now that Cheng Shan was dead, people were suddenly eager to demand justice, which tells you everything you need to know about his current standing. He looked toward the capital, wondering silently if his father, the emperor, truly considered his very existence to be a mistake. And just like that, half a month passed by in the blink of an eye, bringing us to a new chapter in our story. We see Wei Chen sitting cross-legged in the Great Hall, focusing on his breathing, when Zhou enters to announce that General Zhou Xiong has returned. Zhou Xiong is a formidable deputy general of the Sword Terrace, possessing power between the 5th and 8th ranks and commanding 80,000 iron guards. He earned the title of Iron Lock Hero on the battlefields against the northern barbarians, and his reputation for dominance is truly unparalleled. Outside the city, a massive procession stretches for miles like a dragon. Zhou Xiong scans the crowd and asks coldly why Cheng Shan isn't there. He questions how the chief officer of the Sword Terrace could fail to greet him, wondering if the man has forgotten that military law is merciless. His voice booms like a bell and his eyes flash like lightning, radiating a murderous aura fresh from the battlefield that commands absolute silence. The surrounding soldiers can't help but swallow hard in fear as Lu Shantong steps forward and drops to one knee to address the general. He reveals that Cheng Shan was executed by the 6th Prince's blade, news that causes Zhou Xiong's eyes to widen in sudden, sharp fury. That already stifling murderous aura turns violent as he demands to know how this happened, since he valued Cheng Shan's competence despite his limited strength. It seems Cheng Shan was one of his favorites, and yet, after being away for only 6 months, the man is already dead. To make matters worse, he was killed by the blind 6th Prince, a fact that Lu Shantong emphasizes as he bows his head again. Lu Shantong claims they were all deceived by the prince's hidden strength, spinning a tale about the day the prince fought the northern assassins. He lies, saying the prince killed the assassins and then falsely accused Cheng Shan of masterminding the plot without providing a shred of evidence. He paints a tragic picture of Cheng Shan being caught off guard and slain, lamenting that a man who fought barbarians for a decade died with a ruined reputation. With just a few calculated words, Lu Shantong fuels Zhou Xiong's rage until the general is practically vibrating with indignation. Zhou Xiong orders them to lead the way, determined to see how the 6th Prince intends to justify such a public and brazen murder. He snaps his whip and gallops toward the Sword Terrace, while Lu Shantong watches with a cold, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He knows Zhou Xiong is a trusted commander of the emperor, while the 6th Prince is viewed by his own father as nothing more than a lifelong stain. In Lu Shantong's mind, if such a stain were to be wiped away, the emperor would likely be more relieved than vengeful. Meanwhile, back at the Sword Pavilion, Zhou urges Wei Chen to go into hiding to avoid the coming storm, but the prince remains remarkably unconcerned. Instead, we see Wei Chen continue to absorb the spirit of the sword in his hands, until a sudden explosion echoes from the main gates. A moment later, a dozen generals surround the two of them, as a voice bellows that Cheng Shan was a loyal defender of the Sword Terrace. Zhou Xiong, his face twisted with rage, declares that even as a chief officer, the prince had no right to execute him without a trial. He draws his long sword and points it directly at the prince's face. Though Wei Chen is blind, he can clearly feel the weight of that steel. Zhou Xiong's killing intent is palpable, yet Lu Shantong decides to seize the moment, stepping forward to address the general directly. He claims the sixth prince has used his royal status to act with reckless arrogance, treating the sacred sword terrace like his personal playground. Lu Shantong warns that if this behavior is allowed to continue, the prestige of the terrace will vanish, words that fuel Zhou Xiong's fire even further. A flash of murderous intent crosses the general's eyes. Having been away for so long, he knows very little of the prince's true character. But based on these few whispers, he is already convinced the sixth prince deserves to die, and yet, facing this overwhelming pressure, Wei Chen doesn't flinch. He doesn't retreat. Instead, clutching the 7-star Lan Yuan, he walks step by step toward Zhou Xiong and asks a simple question. He asks what the law dictates for those who attempt to assassinate a prince, or for those who dare to collude with the northern barbarians. Finally, he asks what the punishment should be for those who insult a prince and the chief officer of the Sword Terrace, himself. Zhou Xiong stares at the young man who remains composed even under his deadly aura, and after a long silence, he finally provides the answer. For all 3 crimes, the penalty is death. Upon hearing this, Wei Chen lets out a cold laugh as his own killing intent suddenly explodes. He reveals that Cheng Shan insulted him repeatedly from the day he arrived, even while he was accompanied by only 8 humble sword slaves. 4 of those slaves were actually assassins, and he asks the general just how foolish Cheng Shan would have to be to let that happen. He points out that those 4 used northern barbarian techniques and carried barbarian tokens, evidence that is quite hard to ignore, to be honest. He challenges the general to tell him if such men could possibly be loyal soldiers of their own great Song Empire. This barrage of questions leaves Zhou Xiong's rage with nowhere to go, as he realizes the prince has no reason to lie about such verifiable facts. Knowing the truth is only a short investigation away, Zhou Xiong cups his hands in a stiff salute before turning a dark, questioning gaze toward Lu Shantong. Zhou Xiong demands to know if the prince's words are true, and why Lu Shantong failed to mention these details, causing the man to tremble as he grits his teeth. Lu Shantong argues that the sixth prince's claims are merely one-sided, insisting that even if Cheng Shan were a suspect, the law must still be followed. He questions how the prince could execute a soldier of the Sword Terrace without a trial, gradually regaining his composure as he speaks. In his mind, even if Cheng Shan was at fault, the prince had no authority to kill him, especially since the first prince stands behind them both. He assumes that out of respect for the first prince, Zhou Xiong won't act against him, though the general can see he's being used as a pawn. Still, the general admits that Lu Shantong has a point. The sixth prince truly lacked the legal right to execute Cheng Shan without a proper interrogation. Deciding to deal with Lu Shantong later, Zhou Xiong addresses the prince, stating that while he will investigate the claims, the facts remain clear. He points out that the unauthorized killing of a commander is a capital offense under military law, and though Wei Chen is a prince, he cannot go unpunished. Since he cannot execute royalty, he declares that from this day forward, the prince is confined to the Yezhao Palace and may not leave without his orders. Instead of showing anger at this house arrest, Wei Chen simply turns to his servant and gives a chilling command. Shilo Nu, go and slaughter Lu Shantong. The moment the words are spoken, Shilo Nu strikes, prompting a furious Zhou Xiong to swing his sword to intercept the attack. But Zhou Xiong's blade is met by another. His dull eyes fill with utter disbelief as he realizes who has blocked his path. On the other side, Zhou Xiong is stunned to his core. Even though he hadn't used his full strength in that strike, it was no small feat to stop it. The power behind that blow should have been impossible for a mere 6th-rank warrior to withstand, yet the 6th prince blocked it with ease. His shock quickly turns to pure, unadulterated rage. This blatant provocation makes him want to draw his sword and end the prince right then and there. Facing the general's fury, Wei Chen calmly sheaths the Lan Yuan sword, noting that Lu Shantong has provoked him one too many times. He observes that the man is clearly cut from the same cloth as Cheng Shan, and claims he is merely helping the general remove a hidden threat. He tells the general there's no need to thank him, a comment so bold that Zhou Xiong can no longer restrain himself and draws his blade fully. The overwhelming power of an 8th-rank expert erupts as he asks if the prince truly thinks he won't kill him, yet Wei Chen doesn't even blink at the descending steel. He remains indifferent. He knows that while the emperor may not favor him, he is still a prince of great song, and he is no longer the weakling he once was. Deep down, he knows that news of his breakthrough into the 5 paths of cultivation should have reached the Dragon Throne by now. Zhou Xiong's expression shifts. He has lost 2 subordinates for nothing, and he knows the first prince won't let this matter rest easily. Wei Chen pays no mind to the aftermath, certain that even if Zhou Xiong reports his situation to the capital, nothing will change immediately. To be honest, for the Jinlong Emperor, it makes very little difference whether his blind 6th prince is dead or alive. As the following days pass without Zhou Xiong and his men causing trouble, Wei Chen's strength begins to grow at a steady, impressive pace. With the 2 true essence pills from today's check-in, a powerful surge of spiritual energy begins to radiate from within the Yezhao Palace. Suddenly, a thunderous boom echoes as a wave of true chi erupts from the main hall, sweeping through the entire palace in an instant. Even the 7-star Long Yuan's sword vibrates with newfound power as he carefully senses the changes that come with reaching the 7th rank. We return to the Imperial Palace, where the first prince is currently kneeling before the Jinlong Emperor, calling out to his father. He claims to have heard troubling rumors regarding his 6th brother and insists that, after much thought, he must inform the emperor. The Jinlong Emperor remains calm. He already knows exactly what the first prince is about to say, having heard the news himself. Despite knowing about the sword terrace incident, he gestures for the first prince to continue, who then takes a deep, steadying breath. He argues that the emperor sent Wei Chen to the sword terrace for his own good, hoping for him to live a smooth and peaceful life. Instead, he claims the 6th prince took it upon himself to kill a commander and has only become more arrogant and aggressive since then. Now that more soldiers of Great Song have been harmed, he begs the emperor to investigate the matter thoroughly. He warns that failing to act might break the hearts of the frontier soldiers, to which the Jinlong Emperor responds with a soft, thoughtful hum. Admittedly, the 6th prince's performance has surprised him. A blind man killing a 6th-rank general is no small feat. At his age, one could even say he has a promising future, and perhaps if his strength continues to grow, things might change. The emperor muses that if Wei Chen improves, he might no longer be a stain on his life, though he agrees the boy went too far this time. He promises to send someone to investigate when he has time, a dismissive response that immediately makes the first prince grow anxious. The first prince worries that if this matter isn't settled today, it will be far harder to target the 6th prince once he has grown stronger. He suggests that if his brother is being slandered, it's best to clear things up early, otherwise, it might reflect poorly on the emperor's reputation. The Jinlong Emperor's gaze sharpens. Those words have struck a chord, touching upon the one thing he cares about most. As a man who fancies himself an eternal sovereign, his legacy is everything, so he decides he will indeed send someone to investigate. He advises the first prince to broaden his horizons, noting that the movements of the northern Mang are what truly deserve his attention. The first prince nods quickly, clearly sensing the underlying reproach in his father's tone. Still, as long as the emperor investigates, he can plant his own people in the inquiry. Then, his brother's good days will finally be over. Meanwhile, Wei Chen remains unaware of the schemes brewing in the capital, continuing to bolster his strength with the daily check-in pills. It is then that the Shura slave brings troubling news. People in the sword pavilion have noticed that the sword intent is losing its spiritual power. The moment he arrives at the pavilion, he feels a sharp energy locking onto him, likely a direct result of the damaged sword intent. The guards have been doubled, and if this heightened security becomes permanent, it could pose a significant problem for his cultivation. While his method of devouring energy is hidden, it would look highly suspicious if every sword he touched suddenly lost its power. Even a fool would notice the pattern, so he realizes he must be more discreet for the time being. As he makes his way toward the 3rd floor, a figure radiating a sharp, oppressive sword aura suddenly blocks his path. The man introduces himself as Su Daijian of Tsangping and coldly asks the 6th prince to leave if he has no official business. The threat in the man's eyes is unmistakable, yet Wei Chen realizes he has never seen this individual at the sword terrace before. He recalls sensing a faint, sharp sword intent coming from the 5th floor earlier, which he had initially dismissed. He had assumed it was just the natural resonance of the swords, but it seems it was actually this guardian. Regardless, Wei Chen ignores him. He simply picks up a sword and pretends to examine it, while secretly activating his ability to sense the lingering energy within. He absorbs what little remains, but it's a poor substitute for devouring the intent directly. This is clearly not a long-term solution. He realizes that if he remains under the constant surveillance of these guardians, the speed of his cultivation will likely slow down significantly. Over the past few days, his frustration has only grown, as guardians have now appeared not just on the 5th and 6th floors, but on the 3rd and 4th as well, specifically the guardian on the 3rd floor, who seems to enjoy making things difficult. Every time he enters, this man threatens him either openly or in secret, and today, as he reaches the 3rd floor, Su Daijian appears once again. The old man remarks that he heard the prince killed a 6th-rank expert with one strike, admitting he may have underestimated him. However, he coldly reminds Wei Chen that his own strength is at the 8th rank, and killing a mere prince would only take a single move. In that instant, a flash of killing intent crosses Wei Chen's mind. Such a blatant threat is hard to ignore, yet he simply tells the man to move aside. He asks what his business has to do with the guard, questioning if Su Daijian's threats mean he has no respect for the Great Song imperial family. With that single sentence, he shuts down any further insults, leaving Su Daijian with no choice but to step back in frustrated silence. Wei Chen doesn't linger, heading straight for the 4th floor, but on the following day, he decides to skip the sword terrace entirely. The long-awaited envoys from the capital have finally arrived, and as the official in charge, Zhou Xiong joins him to welcome the emperor's messenger. Upon seeing him, Wei Chen can't help but point out that this situation is quite a headache for the general, isn't it? The Sword Terrace serves as the primary northern armory of Great Song, a heavy responsibility, yet a prince living within its walls has been targeted by assassins multiple times, a failure of duty that the general simply cannot avoid. To be honest, he has a point. Hearing this, Zhou Xiong's expression darkens immediately. He knows all too well that the responsibility for these lapses rests squarely on his shoulders. While the emperor is unlikely to execute him, Wei Chen's words cut deep. Not long after, a grand procession finally comes into view. The chief eunuch, Chaoan, steps off his carriage with a face full of displeasure, clearly unhappy about his current assignment. He resents having to travel to this dusty, desolate frontier for the sake of an unfavored sixth prince, though he hides his annoyance behind a mask. He looks toward his subordinates, just as one of them whispers that they have finally arrived at their destination. The aide notes that the sixth prince's attitude toward the emperor seems problematic, as he wasn't even at the city gates to greet them. Hearing these words, Chaoan understands the situation perfectly. It is a delicate matter, especially since the sixth prince is the chief official of the Sword Terrace. By rights, he shouldn't be leaving the city walls so easily, yet Fong Min, the head of the Martial Suppression Bureau's third office, seems to have other ideas. His attitude toward the sixth prince is truly baffling, though to be honest, this is exactly the kind of friction he was hoping for. He simply notes that as the master of the Sword Terrace, the prince really shouldn't be wandering outside the city gates so casually. As a high-ranking official of the Martial Suppression Bureau, Fong Min's disdain for the sixth prince is becoming far too obvious to ignore. Even so, Chaoan doesn't call him out on it. After all, the sixth prince is blind, and when compared to the first prince, well, the choice is clear. He knows exactly when to turn a blind eye to maintain his own standing. It is true that if it were just them, it wouldn't matter, but they are currently representing the emperor's own dignity. The sixth prince's behavior is deemed entirely inappropriate, and as they exchange words, they decide exactly how to treat Li Xianbai. It is a plan born of pure malice. Not long after, the group enters the city, where Wei Chen and the Sword Terrace officials wait to greet them. After the usual polite formalities, Chaoan offers a thin smile and remarks that it has been a long time since he last saw the Sixth Highness. He claims to be relieved to see the prince doing so well, though his tone suggests he might feel quite the opposite. There is no warmth in Chaoan's expression. As Wei Chen exchanges a few brief words with him, another voice suddenly cuts through the air. Fong Min introduces himself as the head of the Martial Suppression Bureau, sent to investigate the deaths of Cheng Shan and Lu Shantong. He demands to confirm a few details, reminding the prince that both Cheng Shan and Lu Shantong were pillars of the Great Song military. He argues that regardless of the reason, for a prince to kill them in public is a grave matter that cannot be overlooked. He asks if the prince considers the laws of Great Song to be mere trifles. Watching this, Zhou Xiong can't help but let a faint smirk play on his lips. He knew the visitors from the capital wouldn't let this go easily. However, faced with Fong Min's interrogation, Wei Chen remains perfectly calm. He reminds the official that he is still a prince of Great Song, questioning the logic of being interrogated before an actual investigation has even begun. Fong Min coldly replies that he will conduct his investigation in due time, warning the prince that this matter is far from over. After all, a prince cannot be judged so lightly, and he notes that Fong Min's words today were perhaps a bit excessive, speaking with a deceptive lightness. He attempts to brush the matter aside, but even as he prepares to leave, he can feel Fong Min's malicious gaze fixed firmly upon him. As night falls, we find Li Xianbai sitting in the main hall, quietly meditating to steady his breath and focus his energy. He knows that increasing one's strength requires a steady, step-by-step approach, especially now when he cannot openly visit the Sword Pavilion. Devouring sword intent in secret is his only path, yet he finds the visitors from the capital are even more troublesome than he had imagined. Deep down, he considers whether he should bring a certain matter to their attention, weighing the risks of such a revelation. The identity of those assassins was simply too obvious to ignore. A few days later, Fong Min storms into the prince's residence with a murderous look. He holds a report in his hand, his mind set on making things difficult. He had expected them to act in the shadows, perhaps with a bit more subtlety. Instead, their malice is displayed with startling clarity, which only proves that they believe they can make him disappear without any need for a cover-up. While he is lost in these thoughts, a sudden commotion erupts outside, the sound of a struggle breaking the silence of the night. The noise vanishes as quickly as it began, but it seems Fong Min is truly unable to wait even a moment longer to make his move. The diplomatic mission has barely settled into the Sword Terrace, and already an assassination attempt has been made. The culprits' identities are far too clear. A few days later, Fong Min bursts into the residence once more, his face a mask of fury as he slams a scroll onto the table with a heavy thud. He addresses the prince sharply, declaring that after several days of investigation, he has uncovered a most interesting set of facts. He claims that after the prince was attacked, Cheng Shan personally wiped out a group of spies from northern Mang, showing a firm and loyal stance. To Fong Min, this is sufficient proof that Cheng Shan had no direct connection to the enemy state of northern Mang whatsoever. Furthermore, their investigation suggests that Lu Shantong never had any contact with northern Mang agents, making his involvement impossible. Hearing this, Li Xianbai can't help but let out a cold laugh, noting that a lack of direct evidence doesn't erase the clear malice Qingshan showed him. He wonders aloud what kind of fool would allow 4 northern Mang assassins to infiltrate a group of 8, not to mention Lu Shantong's own actions. The entire Sword Terrace knows of the intent to assassinate him, yet the official has arrived without even bothering to investigate their true motives. Instead of investigating who ordered the hit, they focus on why he killed the assassins, prompting Li Xianbai to release a surge of killing intent. He appears to be consumed by rage, a sight that fills Fong Min with a secret, twisted joy in this moment. Since no evidence can be found to implicate him directly, Fong Min's goal is simply to provoke the prince into a reckless, violent outburst. By framing it as an attempt to kill out of guilt, he hopes to finally have a legitimate reason to eliminate this blind prince once and for all. Before he can even speak, a general standing nearby can no longer contain himself, insisting that matters must be investigated one step at a time. He claims their current findings already prove the prince had no sufficient reason to kill those men at the time. And so, he suggests the prince should spend his time thinking of a way to clear his own name instead of making demands. As the general tells him to reflect on how to wash away his guilt, Li Xianbai turns his gaze toward the man with cold indifference. He asks if they truly intend to frame him without evidence, wondering aloud if they believe his sword has grown dull. The man merely glances at Fong Min. Seeing the encouragement in Fong Min's eyes, the official continues, stating that he is the one leading the investigation into these very matters. He boldly claims that by next month, the prince will be in prison, and he will personally see him behind bars to avenge Qingshan. He refers to the fallen men as his dearest friends, a statement so absurd it makes Li Xianbai want to laugh out loud. In fact, he would bet that before arriving at the Sword Terrace, this man didn't even know who Qingshan or Lu Shantong were. But that hardly matters. What matters is the reaction they are trying to provoke, though they are destined to be disappointed. After hearing their threats, his expression returns to a calm state as he tells them they will certainly have to work much harder than this. He reminds them that framing a prince is a crime punishable by the execution of one's entire lineage, showing quite a bit of nerve on their part. He wonders if the person standing behind them can truly protect them from the consequences, then turns and leaves without giving them a chance to respond. This time, it is Fong Min who grows anxious, having never expected the situation to spiral out of his control so completely. They realize they cannot allow the 6th prince to return alive, or they will be the ones to face death. The investigation must continue at all costs. They must find evidence by any means necessary, even if they have to invent a reason to kill him. Yet General Zhou Xiong is no fool. He knows eunuch Chao won't support him either. If the evidence is insufficient, they won't just refuse to help, they might even interfere. Fong Min glances at him and speaks in a dark, sinister tone, admitting that finding genuine evidence will indeed be difficult. But all they really need is a simple excuse. If they can't make a move inside the city, they will lure him out beyond the walls. He wonders if the 6th prince could possibly escape them then, causing Tu Yin to freeze for a moment before breaking into a wide grin. The killing intent in Fong Min's eyes is impossible to suppress, while elsewhere, Li Xianbai returns to the Sword Pavilion to absorb the Sword Qi domain. No one comes to cause trouble for him that day, though he can still faintly sense eyes watching him from the shadows at all times. As dusk begins to settle, he glances out the window and prepares to leave, just as several people approach him. They demand to know who he is and why he is inside the Sword Pavilion, their voices sharp as if this were a routine interrogation. However, his perception of killing intent tells him these men are here specifically to cause trouble, even before he can offer a response. Suddenly, another voice rings out, shouting to the senior brother that something has gone wrong with the sealed silver sword. Li Xianbai looks at the sword in the man's hand, the very one he held earlier, and sees that its spiritual energy has completely vanished. It appears as though his own sword seeker ability has thoroughly devoured it, giving the senior brother the perfect opening to speak. He claims it is no wonder the pavilion's sword chi has been failing lately, blaming the prince and ordering his juniors to seize him immediately. He insists on handing him over to their master, and with a flash of steel, the group draws their swords, clearly ready for a fight. Seeing this, Li Xianbai shakes his head helplessly. Though these men are framing him, they have ironically caught the actual culprit this time. The sealed silver sword is a famous blade with its own spiritual rhythm, which usually keeps it humming with power. Under normal circumstances, that rhythm never fades. Only a top-tier master could break it, or perhaps a specialized spirit-dissolving powder. If someone had used such a powder, the evidence would still be right here, and the most suspicious person present is obvious. It is undoubtedly the disciple currently holding the sword, whose face suddenly turns pale as the realization hits him. A cold sweat breaks out on his forehead, for the remnants of that very spirit-dissolving powder are still hidden inside his own pocket. The panicked disciple shouts that Li Xianbai is trying to frame him, urging the senior brother to attack, but we see that Li Xianbai doesn't wait for them to move. With a swift backhand strike, he sends the disciple flying. The man tries to block the blow, but a moment later, he is coughing up blood in midair. To be honest, the disciple's strength was barely at the 8th level, so there was no way he could have withstood such a direct assault. In the next heartbeat, Li Xianbai appears right in front of him and pulls the remaining spirit-dissolving powder directly from the man's pocket. This sudden turn of events causes everyone's expression to shift. His movements were so fast that they simply didn't have time to react. Now, the tables have turned, and he has caught them red-handed, leaving the senior brother of the Tsongping sect trembling with a mix of shock and fury. Faced with such undeniable evidence, the senior brother hesitates to act, while in the shadows, Su Daijin watches on with eyes full of killing intent. Even the guardians on the other floors of the pavilion turn their gaze toward the scene, feeling that the Tsongping sect has finally gone too far. Such a blatant provocation makes it clear they are working with someone in the imperial court, someone who clearly has no love for the sixth prince. It is a dangerous game they are playing, and Li Xianbai knows exactly how deep these political alliances usually run. He calmly announces that he has found the true culprit for them, presenting the powder as absolute proof of their own treachery. Gripping the guilty disciple by the throat, he offers a cold smile, while the senior brother demands, with a darkened face, that he release his junior. The senior brother insists that Tsongping sect will handle its own affairs, but Li Xianbai remains unmoved, and in the next instant, he tightens his grip. A sharp crack echoes through the hall as the light fades from the disciple's eyes. Seeing this, the situation reaches a point of no return. The senior brother's eyes turn bloodshot with rage, his fury finally boiling over at the sight of his fallen comrade. Li Xianbai speaks of his three sword styles, the first being for killing, as the 7-star Longyuan sword begins to hum with a deadly, chilling energy. The room is suddenly filled with a cold light as waves of sword chi dance through the air, carrying the scent of blood in their wake. In what seems like a mere heartbeat, nearly all the Tsongping sect disciples have fallen, leaving only the senior brother still standing. The senior brother cries out for his master in a voice full of grief and indignation, just as Li Xianbai prepares to strike one final time. Suddenly, an incredibly violent surge of energy erupts, and a piercing, cold light flies toward him with terrifying speed. Li Xianbai's movements don't falter for a single second. His long sword continues to dance as he executes the third style, meant for killing all living things. In an instant, the senior brother's head is sent flying high into the air. Despite being at the 6th rank of the 5th realm, he had no power to resist. It is only then that Su Daijin's attack finally reaches him, fueled by a cold and desperate fury. He unleashes the full power of the 8th rank, and with a sudden, sharp blast of wind, Li Xianbai is forced to retreat rapidly. Although he has reached the 7th rank himself, he realizes that facing such terrifying power head-on is still a daunting challenge. Su Daijin is now consumed by a burning resentment, having never imagined that Li Xianbai's strength had already reached the 7th rank. To be honest, if he hadn't miscalculated the boy's growth, his top disciple might not have died such a swift and effortless death. And yet, even this strike delivered in a fit of rage only managed to push the young man back without causing any significant injury. At this moment, a flicker of regret begins to take root in his heart. Perhaps he shouldn't have chased after these so-called benefits. He wonders if dragging the Tsongping sect into the murky waters of imperial politics was a mistake, just as Lu Jingyi had warned. The martial world and the imperial court may share the same waters, but as long as one doesn't actively dive into the conflict, there is peace. Sects like theirs usually have no reason to fear the court's interests, but now, he realizes there is no turning back. The Tsongping sect and the 6th prince are now mortal enemies, and he knows that if the prince is allowed to live, it wouldn't take 5 years for the entire sect to be wiped out. This realization causes his killing intent to boil over completely. He lunges forward with his sword, aiming to end the threat once and for all. Normally, a 7th rank facing an 8th rank in such a confined space would be a death sentence, but suddenly, a powerful surge of sword energy erupts from the side. With a sound like a thunderclap, Su Daijin is intercepted. His expression sours the moment he sees exactly who has stepped in. He snarls at Lu Jingyi to get out of his way, but Lu doesn't show the slightest intention of backing down. Lu warns his old friend that if he kills the 6th prince today, Emperor Jinlong will have the perfect excuse to crush the martial world under his boots. As he speaks, 3 more figures appear, quietly surrounding Su Daijin and cutting off any hope of a quick escape. Each of the 3 newcomers radiates an incredibly overbearing power, with even the weakest among them having reached the 8th rank. We see that they all understand the unspoken agreement between the court and the martial world, a balance that keeps Emperor Jinlong from acting rashly. To be honest, if he were to break that peace, the backlash from the entire martial world would threaten his very reign. Yet, the Emperor never stops looking for ways to weaken these sects, regardless of whether the 6th prince is currently in his favor or not. At the very least, the prince cannot die so openly at the hands of martial artists. Watching the 4 masters appear, Li Xianbai spits out a mouthful of blood. An 8th rank strike delivered in fury is not something easily endured, even for a talent like him. Such are the methods of a true master. He tells himself that as long as he survives today, he will return to wipe out the entire Tsongping sect in the future. The killing intent in his voice is completely undisguised as he speaks. Then, he finally sheathes the 7-star Longyuan sword. With a steady pace, he begins to leave the sword pavilion, while from a distance, the furious roars of Su Daijian echo behind him. Everything is proceeding exactly as he anticipated. In fact, he almost hoped Su Daijian would strike, as enemies who have already revealed themselves are much better off as corpses. Suddenly, an eye begins to manifest on the back of his previously smooth hand. At the same time, hideous, distorted patterns start to crawl across his skin, triggered by the intense stimulation of his own killing intent. He finds himself struggling to control this demonic hand, which hasn't revealed its true, terrifying form in quite a long time. The news of the Sword Pavilion incident reaches Fong Ming quickly. We find Tu Yin looking at Fong Ming with a face full of worry. He insists they cannot wait any longer, certain that Eunuch Chao has already sent word back. This is their final window of opportunity. If the Emperor's decree arrives first, they are as good as dead, especially now that the 6th prince has reached the 7th rank. A faint, cold smile curls at the corner of Fong Ming's mouth. He isn't worried. Even a powerful martial artist has their limits. Before 100 elite, battle-hardened soldiers, even a master will meet a bitter end, and the 6th prince is essentially a man alone. He has no powerful subordinates left to protect him. Hearing this, Tu Yin immediately understands the gravity of the situation. This coming conflict has only one goal: to ensure that the 6th prince does not leave with his life. This coming conflict has only one true objective: to ensure that the 6th prince does not leave with his life. Yes, the goal is absolute. They are determined to win this war by claiming the prince's head once and for all. In this struggle, the 6th prince is essentially a man alone, with no powerful subordinates left to protect him. Tu Yin understands the gravity of the situation immediately, and the two of them break into a chilling, synchronized laughter. We see the undercurrents swirling around the sword pavilion, yet for Li Xianbai, these changes haven't disrupted his daily routine. Though the current situation appears incredibly dangerous, he remains remarkably calm amidst the gathering storm. Everything is proceeding mostly as he anticipated, and he is prepared to respond. Not long after, another day begins. Just as he finishes absorbing his latest rewards, Shiluan Nu rushes in, shouting that something has happened at the sword pavilion. A fierce battle broke out last night. A powerful guardian was assassinated, and the killer managed to escape completely unscathed. This news is quite unexpected. Those guarding the pavilion are usually between the 5th and 8th rank, and they never stand alone. He wonders what kind of person could possess such skill, but Shiluan Nu simply shakes his head in ignorance. Taking the 7-star Longyuan, he heads toward the pavilion and soon encounters General Zhou Xiong waiting outside. The general warns him that for his own safety, he should leave immediately given the recent violence. He tells the general that he has grown quite fond of this place and is naturally worried about the recent turn of events. He asks which of the guardians was lost, prompting Zhou Xiong to give him a long, searching look. It was an 8th-rank elder from the Wuji sect. Since the culprit is still at large, the prince is advised to stay away. Deep down, he feels a flicker of disappointment. It's a pity it wasn't Su Daijian of the Tsongping sect who met that end. He agrees to leave for now, offering his hollow hopes that the general catches the villain soon before departing. As he turns to leave with Shiluan Nu, he considers the strength of an assassin capable of killing an 8th-rank master. With a sense of anticipation, he opens the system. Another successful check-in grants him the divine eye of truth, dispelling illusions to reveal the truth. As the system's voice fades, we see waves of true qi beginning to circulate within his eyes. After a sudden, searing heat, he snaps his eyes open, and 2 lines of warm tears begin to flow down his cheeks. For the first time, he can truly see. While his ghost hand allowed him to sense his surroundings, it was never quite the same. To a man who has lived in darkness for over a decade, the divine eye of truth feels like a restoration of his very soul. Realizing he has grown another year older, he opens the 1000-path system with a heart full of genuine excitement. The divine eye is undoubtedly his greatest reward yet, though its functions clearly go far beyond simple sight. First and foremost is the gift of clairvoyance. Through these eyes, no physical obstacle can block his vision if he wills it. Even a thick stone wall becomes transparent to him, and more importantly, he can now track the flow of true qi itself. He smiles as he watches the energy circulating within his own body, knowing he'll never have to fear qi deviation again. Furthermore, in the heat of battle, he will be able to see exactly how an enemy's internal energy is moving. This means he can predict an opponent's every move with ease, a feat that is, without question, a literal miracle. While he was occupied with mastering his new sight, the world outside was busy falling into further chaos at the border. The conflict has spread beyond the frontier, as traces of northern Mang cavalry have been spotted even outside the Jiantai region. The chief eunuch, Chaoan, is becoming increasingly restless, repeatedly urging Fong Min and the others to leave as soon as possible. However, Fong Min continues to delay him with various excuses, though in truth, the man is becoming quite frustrated himself. Ever since the cavalry appeared, he has tried multiple times to lure the 6th prince out into the open to face them. But the prince seems utterly indifferent to military glory, leaving Fong Min with no opening to make his move. Suddenly, an urgent report arrives from the front. The northern Mang have launched a massive assault, plunging the border into crisis. Upon hearing this, General Zhou Xiong pales and immediately leads 50,000 iron guards to the border to join the defense. With 30,000 troops left to guard Jiantai, our prince quietly makes his way back into the sword pavilion once more. The previous guardian of the pavilion had come from the 4th floor, which finally gave our prince a chance to devour some sword chi. But just as he reached out to absorb the energy, a sudden surge of killing intent filled the sword pavilion. Who could it be? With a thunderous roar that echoed through the halls, the entire sword pavilion began to vibrate violently. The voice belonged to Su Daijian of the Tsangping sect, but at that same moment, 2 other powerful auras suddenly erupted. Following a loud explosion, Su Daijian was sent flying out of the pavilion, his face turning pale from the impact. Facing a simultaneous attack from an 8th and 9th rank master was simply too much, even with his full defense. It is here that we finally get a clear look at the attackers who dared to strike so boldly. With their strange facial features and bodies covered in totems, it was obvious they were from Northern Mang. Lu Jingyi and another guardian quickly appeared outside, and in an instant, all 5 men were at each other's throats. Lu Jingyi glared at the 2 intruders, his expression darkening as he called them out for being Northern Mang thieves. He asked if they truly thought they could come and go as they pleased, but the man named Anaitu only laughed. Anaitu boasted that he had already killed an 8th rank master last time, so these 2.5 men couldn't stop them. As the words fell, the 5 resumed their chaotic battle, the sound of shockwaves and flying debris filling the entire street. Meanwhile, a Northern Mang scout took advantage of the distraction to quietly slip into the sword pavilion. Anaita's actual mission was to tie down the 3 guardians, using the loud confrontation to draw everyone's attention. This allowed his subordinate to sneak in and steal the swords. As for the 6th prince inside, he didn't care about him at all. In his eyes, the prince was merely a blind man, but he had no idea that our protagonist had already spotted the intruder. He followed the scout quietly, without striking immediately, curious to see what the Northern Mang people were actually after. As the intruder moved deeper, we follow them to the 6th floor, where any of the famous swords kept there would be legendary. Each blade was powerful enough to cause a bloodbath in the outside world, yet the intruder didn't seem interested in them at all. Instead, his eyes were fixed intently on a pitch-black blade resting before him, the sword of the Demon Lord. His gaze was filled with a deep, feverish excitement as he reached out and finally placed his hand upon the hilt. But just then, a soft, low whisper echoed from directly behind him, asking what exactly he meant by the sword of the Demon Lord. The voice was calm, yet it carried a weight that made the intruder freeze in his tracks. What could this title possibly mean? The intruder's pupils dilated in instant shock as he spun around to face the blindfolded man standing right there. It was the 6th prince of Datsong. Clearly, the scout hadn't coordinated with Anaitu, or he would have known our protagonist was watching. However, once he realized the prince was alone, his initial wariness transformed into a thick, suffocating killing intent. He slowly lifted the Demon Lord's sword, explaining that a man once used this very blade to slaughter the people of Northern Mang. He claimed the sword had been stained black by their blood, and since then, every Northern Mang soul has dreamed of its destruction. To them, it was a heavy stone crushing the spine of their nation, but he believed that after today, everything would change. His expression grew fanatical as he declared they would snap this blade with their own hands on the field of battle. They wanted their warriors to watch that cursed demon lord be utterly destroyed, paving the way for Northern Mang to rise again. Our prince simply nodded, finding this answer surprisingly exciting, which, to be honest, was probably not the reaction the scout expected. The sword chi on the 6th floor was entirely different from the levels below, and he had never had the chance to touch it until now. It seemed the Northern Mang people had inadvertently delivered a magnificent gift right to his doorstep. Seeing the prince remain so unervingly calm, the Northern Mang scout roared and lunged forward with his blade. But as he drew near, his body began to tremble uncontrollably. The blind man before him suddenly felt like a demon cloaked in black mist. In that heartbeat, the 7-star Dragon Abyss sword unsheathed itself, carrying a surge of pure, cold, killing intent. In the very next instant, the Dragon Abyss transformed into 1,000 points of cold light, sealing off the entire space. The scout felt as if he were trapped in a literal rain of swords with nowhere to hide, desperately raising his own blade to survive. Under the weight of our prince's overbearing killing intent, the scout's movements seemed to slow to a crawl. A moment later, his blood fell like raindrops, slowly pooling into a crimson stain upon the floor. Outside, the battle continued to rage, with Su Daijian's urgent shouts echoing through the sword pavilion. Meanwhile, Anida's life force began to drain away rapidly, while the power within our protagonist surged to new heights. Not long after, a faint sound of something shattering echoed from deep within his body. The Demon Lord's sword had withered into an ordinary blade, and he had finally stepped into the 8th rank of his path. At that exact moment, Anaitu, who was still locked in combat with Lu Jingyi, suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. Su Daijian seized this opening, unleashing a terrifying palm strike that surged through Anaito's entire frame. The sheer force of an 8th rank blow sent him flying backward, straight toward the interior of the sword pavilion. Now, even though Anaito was heavily injured, Su Daijian's strike hadn't been enough to deliver a truly fatal wound. He was battered, yes, but he remained a deadly threat, a fact that Su Daijian seemed strangely comfortable with. It appeared Su Daijian was intentionally putting the 6th prince in a very precarious position. Anaito crashed into the pavilion, coughing up more blood as he struggled to regain his footing. His eyes immediately landed on our prince and the nearby corpse. Finally, he understood why his man had never emerged. Everything had been ruined by this ant before him. This boy had single-handedly dismantled their entire plan. The failure had left them in a desperate situation, and his gaze burned with a pure, murderous hatred. At that moment, Lu Jingyi rushed forward to shield the prince, urging him to flee while also noticing the dead scout. Lu Jingyi quickly pieced it together and turned to Anaito, realizing they had hidden an extra hand in the shadows. He noted that despite being at a disadvantage, the enemy hadn't fled, though clearly, their scheme had now failed. He looked at our prince with newfound respect. Without him, they likely would have met a grim fate today. Upon hearing Lu Jingyi's words, Anaito glared at our prince with pure hatred, while Su Daijian began to speak with a strange, mocking tone. He remarked that they were lucky to have the 6th prince there, or they might have suffered a significant loss today. These words caused Lu Jingyi's expression to shift instantly. He had carefully avoided using any titles when addressing the prince. He didn't want Anaito to know the boy's true identity, because regardless of Anaito's mission, killing a prince would be a massive victory. By revealing the secret, Su Daijian was intentionally stoking the fires of Anaito's rage, a dangerous game, to be sure. Anaito let out a cold laugh, having already seen right through Su Daijian's transparent scheme. His eyes fell upon the demon lord's sword lying on the ground, and without another thought, he lunged violently toward our prince. Lu Jingyi moved to intercept the blow, but Su Daijian cut him off, shouting for the prince to be careful while blocking Lu's path. It was a calculated move. By obstructing Lu Jingyi, he effectively cleared a path for Anaito to strike the prince down. Anaito roared, unleashing a strike that displayed the full, terrifying power of the 9th rank in all its glory. Su Daijian watched with a cold smirk, while Lu Jingyi closed his eyes, unable to bear the sight of what was coming. In their eyes, there was no way the prince could dodge such a lethal blow. It seemed the end had finally arrived. But suddenly, a terrifying aura erupted from the prince, transforming into a streak of light that poured toward Anaito. Anaito's strength was extraordinary. Unlike the 7th rank scout from before, he wasn't completely paralyzed by the pressure. However, even a warrior of his caliber couldn't entirely ignore the prince's killing intent, forged from countless swallowed sword essences. Anaito's movements faltered for a mere heartbeat, and in that split second, the prince vanished, reappearing directly in front of Su Daijian. A sudden wave of dread washed over Su Daijian as the prince's overwhelming aura crashed down upon him instead. His body froze in place, completely rigid, just as Anaito's blade plunged deep into Su Daijian's chest. And so, Su Daijian fell, his face twisted in utter disbelief as he died, though our prince didn't spare him a single glance. Without a moment's hesitation, Anaito turned his blade toward the prince once more, while Lu Jingyi rushed forward to intervene. Anaito lunged once more with murderous intent, but by now, Lu Jingyi had already stepped firmly in front of our prince to shield him. He warned the traitor that the Iron Guard had already surrounded the area, leaving him with no chance of escape and every reason to surrender. Lu Jingyi shouted these words because, to be honest, he had no desire to continue this grueling struggle against Anaito. He understood Anaito's combat power all too well, fearing that in a desperate final stand, the man might take him down as well. And so, hoping for a peaceful end, he urged a surrender, prompting Anaito to cast a fleeting, desperate glance toward the outside world. For a moment, his eyes were filled with pure despair, but that feeling was instantly replaced by a wave of reckless, unbridled madness. With a sudden roar, Anaito charged at Lu Jingyi, driven by a suicidal resolve that left no room for fear in his heart. He launched a ferocious assault, completely ignoring Lu Jingyi's incoming blade and allowing his own chest to be pierced just to land a strike. His sword slashed across Lu Jingyi's chest, leaving the commander in sudden, searing pain as the situation took a turn for the worse. With unstoppable momentum, Anaito turned his fury toward our prince, screaming that a prince of Datsong would be joining him in death. Lu Jingyi's heart sank in alarm. He tried to move to the rescue, but he was simply a fraction of a second too slow. Yet, facing this lethal charge, our prince remained utterly composed as the 7-star Dragon Abyss sword suddenly leaped from its scabbard. In that instant, every sword within the pavilion seemed to sense a divine presence, beginning to hum and vibrate in a collective, haunting chorus. A towering wave of sword intent was released without restraint, and facing such a powerful foe, the prince's own fighting spirit reached a new peak. As that overwhelming power surged forth, we see him standing firm against a warrior of truly terrifying caliber. The dragon abyss sword let out a long, resonant cry, its intent transforming into a gale that slammed violently against Anita's blade. A thunderous explosion shook the air, and suddenly, Anita's charging body came to a dead, jarring halt right then and there. With a face full of shock and bitter resentment, he collapsed heavily to the ground, leaving Lu Jingyi just as stunned by what he had witnessed. However, before any words could be exchanged, the mournful sound of a distant horn suddenly echoed through the air. The sounds of an army gathering began to rise. It was the assembly call of the Iron Guard, appearing at the most critical of moments. He feared a massive army was laying siege to the pavilion, and his eyes betrayed a deep worry about the chaos unfolding outside. Under normal circumstances, the Sword Pavilion should have been perfectly safe, but now, that sense of security had completely vanished. Of the 4 great guardians, 2 now lay dead, and the other 2 were severely wounded. Any further mishap could lead to the total destruction of the pavilion, a place that stands as a pillar between heaven and earth. They knew they had to secure the pavilion quickly to ease their troubled minds, though this battle was far from over. It seemed unlikely to escalate into a full-scale war, yet they desperately needed something to lift their spirits. Their hearts remained heavy, weighed down by the fact that 2 of their strongest defenders were now incapacitated. If any more trouble arose, the pavilion, the very heart of the world's martial balance, might be lost forever. As the sacred site where 100 legendary weapons were forged, its fall would be an unthinkable catastrophe. Their respective sects would never be forgiven for such a failure. Old Lu, this is the Sword Pavilion. It won't fall so easily. The other wounded guardian tried to offer comfort, noting that while Anita's companion escaped, he had lost an arm in the process. Lu Jingyi nodded slowly, then turned his gaze toward our prince. Sixth Highness, we must know what happened inside. As the atmosphere within the pavilion shifted, their eyes began to scan the surroundings with growing suspicion. We see their gaze fall upon the lifeless corpse from earlier, and then settle on the demon lord's sword lying nearby. Taking a deep breath, the prince calmly explained that a powerful warrior from the Northern Alliance had infiltrated the inner sanctum. He claimed he had to wait for the perfect opening to strike him down, adding that he knew nothing of the sword's current state. It appeared the weapon had been damaged by the intruder, a revelation that caused Lu Jingyi and his companion to exchange looks of regret. They had long suspected the Northern Alliance harbored ill intentions toward the pavilion, but they had misjudged the true target. They assumed the enemy simply wanted to destroy the pavilion because of its immense symbolic importance to the realm. To be honest, they never could have imagined that the intruder's real goal was the legendary Yangyu sword all along. Seeing that the 2 guardians didn't press the matter, our prince felt a wave of relief, even as the horns of war continued to blare outside. Beyond the Sword Pavilion, the battle was rapidly reaching a fever pitch. Countless warriors from the Northern Alliance were launching a relentless charge toward the platform, testing the very limits of the defenses. As the Northern Alliance surged forward, Han Jingming, the commander of the Iron Guard, watched with a grim expression clouding his face. It hadn't been long since Zhou Xiong departed before the attack began. Clearly, the enemy had come well prepared. The most troubling part was that the pavilion was being attacked simultaneously, and to suggest the 2 events were unrelated was simply absurd. He found it impossible to believe in such a coincidence. Suddenly, a voice boomed from below. Han Zhengming, surrender the city immediately. If we are forced to take this platform by storm, we will slaughter everyone and spend 3 days pillaging the city. The powerful expert from the Northern Alliance shouted from below, his voice resonating like a great bronze bell. His voice alone reached the top of the walls with ease, yet despite the terrifying threat, Han Zhengming remained remarkably composed. To be honest, he didn't seem particularly worried. While the siege looked dangerous on the surface, he sensed something was off. In reality, it was a feint. The enemy's assault looked fierce, but they weren't truly fighting to the death. They were merely buying time for those attacking the pavilion. It was at this moment that Fang Ming and his men arrived on the scene. Seeing Fang Ming appear, Han Zhengming's expression darkened. Lord Fang, what are you doing here? Why aren't you at your post defending the Sword Pavilion? Fang Ming looked rather displeased by the questioning tone. He argued that the pavilion was only facing a small raid by a few experts, and its defenses should handle such minor troubles easily enough. Han Zhengming frowned. While Fang Ming's logic was sound, the Sixth Highness was inside that pavilion every single day. Given the prince's current reputation for weakness, a Northern Alliance raid could easily turn into a fatal disaster for him. He couldn't afford to take that responsibility, but since Fang Ming was already here, there was little else he could say. And just then, a figure leaped onto the city wall with incredible speed, catching everyone by surprise. The man was a wretched sight, covered in dust and blood, and he had even lost an arm in the struggle. At the same time, another figure was in hot pursuit, moving with such incredible speed that he was little more than a blur. With a few nimble leaps, the pursuer cleared the city wall and vanished below, leaving the onlookers breathless. Only then did they realize who was doing the chasing. Zhang watched the figure jump, but chose not to follow. To be honest, jumping down at that moment would have been far too dangerous, even for someone of his skill. Fang Ming watched the scene, convinced that the battle at the Sword Pavilion must have finally reached its end. The fact that someone from the Northern Alliance managed to escape suggested the fight was anything but easy. Surely, the Sixth Highness was dead by now. He turned to Chowan, asking with feigned urgency what would happen if the prince had actually met his end while Chowan was away. Fong Ming's face was a mask of deep concern, and if we didn't know better, we might actually believe he cared. However, before Chowan could even open his mouth to respond, our prince's voice rang out, telling Lord Fong he could rest easy. He made it clear he wasn't so easily killed, and at the sight of him, Fong Ming's expression shifted instantly. A flash of dark resentment crossed Fong Ming's eyes as he feigned surprise that the prince was still alive and questioned how the Northern Alliance gathered such forces. He quickly tried to change the subject, wondering aloud how so many enemies had managed to infiltrate the sword platform area. Seeing Fong Ming try to deflect, our prince decided not to press the issue, though he had seen the man's true colors quite clearly. He had been careful not to reveal his true strength, knowing that discretion was his greatest weapon for now. As long as he remained within the sword platform, he felt a sense of absolute security, despite the Northern Alliance's reputation for slaughter. Even without a full-scale war declared between the two sides, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The Northern Alliance never missed an opportunity to target the people of Great Song, and though our prince was no soldier, he knew exactly what kind of monsters they were. He may not have cared for Emperor Jinglong or the spiteful officials of the court, but he had his own principles. Deep down, he had no intention of letting the Northern Alliance trample over the land of Great Song while he still drew breath. Now that trouble had flared up at the front lines, Han Jingming spoke up, making it clear he wasn't about to stand idly by. He assured the prince that General Zhou Xiong had taken 50,000 iron guards with him, so even a large-scale Northern Alliance attack would be held. With General Zhou reinforcing the front, it would be impossible for the enemy to break through in the short term. These attackers, he suggested, were likely just opportunists who had slipped through while the front lines were momentarily unstable. Once the situation at the front stabilized, they would naturally turn their attention to dealing with these intruders. As he spoke, a cold sneer flickered in his eyes. However, he noted that words alone weren't enough. He remarked that if his 30,000 iron guards couldn't even handle this, they would be no better than common livestock. This statement was actually quite surprising to hear. To be honest, such bold words were unexpected. It was enough to prove that, in his own way, this man truly considered himself a capable general. Not long after that, the momentum of the battle began to shift. Seeing the Northern Alliance's offensive slow down, Han Jingming turned to leave, and soon the city gates swung wide. 20,000 iron guards assembled instantly, with Han Jingming himself leading the charge at the very front. Faced with the sudden, disciplined surge of 20,000 soldiers, the Northern Alliance army quickly chose to retreat. Han Jingming didn't bother with a pursuit. After all, the situation beyond the walls remained dangerously unclear. For him, protecting the sword platform was the priority. Meanwhile, though the Northern Alliance was technically retreating, their ranks remained perfectly orderly as they withdrew, suggesting their losses were actually quite minimal. Inside the main enemy tent, several men helped Lutai inside. When the commanding general saw Lutai's condition, his face paled with shock. He demanded to know how this happened and where Anita was. Lutai, heavily wounded and barely able to breathe, whispered the grim news. Anitu was already dead. Worse still, the Demon Lord's sword was lost, and all of this was the work of Great Song's Sixth Highness. He insisted that only by killing the Sixth Highness could they wash away their failures, leaving Gushi in a heavy, thoughtful silence. Under the current circumstances, we can see that taking the life of Great Song's Sixth Highness would be an incredibly difficult task. Furthermore, their recent siege had cost them dearly. Just as the two were at a loss, a guard suddenly rushed into the tent. The guard reported that a man from Great Song was waiting outside the camp, requesting an urgent audience with the general. Both men frowned simultaneously at the news, but after a brief moment of hesitation, they signaled the guard to let the stranger in. Before long, a man stepped inside, prompting Gushi to demand who he was and what business he had in a Northern Alliance camp. Gushi's voice was thick with murderous intent, suggesting he was ready to strike the man down at the slightest provocation. The stranger introduced himself as General Tu from the capital of Great Song, claiming he had come to cooperate in killing the Sixth Highness. He noted that the Northern Alliance surely shared this desire. This man was, in fact, the calculating Tu Yen. Hearing this, Gushi became even more suspicious, asking if Tu Yen was actually planning to defect to the Northern Alliance. Tu Yen scoffed, remarking that he had no intention of joining barbarians. They simply happened to share a common goal. Gushi and Lutai ignored his disdain and instead began to smile, asking exactly how he proposed they should cooperate. Tu Yen explained that he needed them to arrange a retreating force, which would serve as the bait to lure the Sixth Highness out. As for what happened after that, he assured them they wouldn't need to lift a finger, and the two leaders nodded in agreement. Seeing their approval, Tu Yen smiled. He was certain that even if the Sixth Highness was a coward, he couldn't resist such easy glory. After all, the prince surely wouldn't want to pass up a chance to return to the capital as a true hero of Great Song. Meanwhile, outside the sword platform, wave after wave of soldiers from the Achelan tribe were being systematically wiped out. For many of the generals stationed at the platform, these Northern Alliance soldiers had essentially become easy stepping stones for promotion. As for our protagonist, he no longer spent his days simply moving back and forth between the Sword Pavilion and Yijiaogong. He had moved past his old routine of oscillating between the two locations, especially since he had only just achieved a new breakthrough. He realized that pushing for further breakthroughs was yielding diminishing returns, just as urgent news arrived from the front lines about a Northern Alliance unit. The report mentioned that the heavily injured Enlutai was among them, and soon after, Han Jingming came to find our protagonist. Han Jingming argued that this was a golden opportunity, noting that since Enlutai had lost an arm, killing him would be quite simple. It would serve as an excellent military achievement. Hearing this, the prince didn't refuse immediately, sensing Han Jingming's underlying intentions. After all, Han Jingming had offended the prince previously, and offering him a chance at such glory was a way to make amends. It was a perfectly normal way to smooth over their relationship, and the prince knew well enough that Han Jingming meant no harm. However, we can suspect the matter wasn't quite that simple, yet he chose not to reject Han Jingming's proposal regardless. He declared that he would set out at once, as that traitor Enlutai had dared to intrude upon the sacred sword pavilion. The prince claimed that failing to execute the man who killed great Song's experts would leave a permanent stain on his heart. These words sounded quite grand and noble, even stirring Han Jingming's blood, though both men knew it was mostly just rhetoric. Meanwhile, before the prince even left the city, Fang Ming received word that his elaborate trap had finally been set in motion. All their hard work had paid off, as the Sixth Highness had finally taken the bait. Fang Ming then turned his gaze toward Tu Yan. With the battles at the sword platform ending and the prince eager to return to the capital, this was their final window of opportunity. They couldn't afford to miss it, and Tu Yan assured him that his men were already in position, waiting for the target to emerge. Fang Ming's voice trembled with a hint of excitement as he vowed that once the prince left the city, there would be no return. He was relieved to finally finish this task, knowing that any further delay would be difficult to explain to the first prince. At the same time, our protagonist led the 800 iron guards promised by Han Jingming out of the city gates. According to the intelligence, Enlutai was recovering from his wounds in a location about 70 miles away from the sword platform. A local farming family had reportedly been slaughtered for offending him, with only a young son surviving because he wasn't home. This survivor had brought the news to the sword platform, but as they rode, Xuanu looked at the prince with a touch of doubt. She pointed out that with a 70-mile journey ahead, if Fang Ming truly had a scheme in mind, they would likely find themselves isolated and without reinforcements. Even with 800 iron guards by their side, the sheer distance meant those men couldn't provide a true sense of security in enemy territory. If Fang Ming was actually making a move, he would have certainly accounted for the presence of this specific unit in his calculations. The prince simply waved his hand, seemingly unconcerned. After all, they were currently in the very heart of the Great Song Empire. He noted that even if Enlutai gathered all his nearby men, they wouldn't exceed 3,000, and they were already scattered into small groups. Even if they were ambushed, the prince felt their current force was enough to fight their way back to the sword pavilion, assuming they only faced Northern Alliance numbers. He was confident they couldn't pose a real threat, and secretly, he was curious to see what other tricks Fang Ming might have prepared. Xiluanu nodded solemnly, knowing his role was merely to offer counsel. As for the prince's final decision, that was beyond his station. His duty was simple, to use the 3 feet of cold steel in his hand to clear a path for his master, one strike at a time. He turned his gaze toward the men behind him and reminded them that without the prince, none of them would even exist today. He declared that if anyone wished to harm the prince, they would have to do so by stepping over their cold, lifeless bodies. Behind him stood 30 men who shared his burden, answering his call with a thunderous roar. Every single one of them was just like him. They had all been practicing the six-realm sword technique. Though their training had been brief, the unique nature of the style changed everything. It gave them formidable strength. Even facing a charge of 300 men, they didn't show a hint of fear as they marched into formation. He led his men toward the objective, but as they drew near, the commander of the Iron Guard frowned. Something was bothering him. The situation seemed wrong. Not a single living soul could be seen in the village, not even a wisp of cooking smoke in the air. And this was at high noon, mind you. Right at that moment, a sudden noise erupted from all directions. It was the sound of weapons clashing. A voice rang out, filled with mockery. "Ha! The Prince of Datsong has finally fallen for it." The voice was a bitter mix of triumph and resentment. Then, the one-armed Enlutai stepped out from the shadows. The moment these enemies appeared, the Iron Guard tensed. Enlutai glared at them, his presence heavy with a thirst for revenge. The moment these enemies appeared, the commander of the Iron Guard's expression shifted instantly as he ordered his men to form ranks. 800 Iron Guards immediately entered a state of full combat readiness, their commander's face turning cold with grim realization. Seeing the Northern Alliance soldiers before them, it was obvious even to a fool that this ambush meant there was a traitor within the sword pavilion. The prince looked at the Northern Alliance warriors without a hint of worry, his gaze settling on the one-armed Enlutai. He asked if a cripple really thought he could kill him, or if this small group truly expected to wipe out 800 elite Iron Guards. It seemed unlikely they had enough strength, though in Lutai's face remained dark. He had already gathered some intelligence on the prince's progress. He knew the prince had reached the 7th realm, while he himself, though an 8th realm master, was now missing an arm. Furthermore, his injuries hadn't fully healed yet. Under these circumstances, it was hard to say which of them would actually emerge victorious. However, since they had set a trap today, they naturally had a backup plan, and Lutai called out for Fong Ming to show himself. He warned that since this was Fong Ming's scheme, he wouldn't be allowed to just sit back and watch the tigers fight from a distance. As his voice echoed, a unit of soldiers wearing great song armor emerged from the side, led by the man himself. Fong Ming remarked that the 6th prince had hidden well, but as long as he intended to return to the capital, he eventually had to leave the city. And now, here he was, walking straight into his own demise. Behind Fong Ming, the situation grew even more dire. Tu Yin had arrived with 500 elite troops to coordinate with the Northern Alliance, effectively surrounding the Iron Guard. With the perimeter fully sealed, Fong Ming felt a surge of absolute triumph. There were over 1,000 Northern Alliance cavalrymen present. Add to that the 500 Great Song border troops, and the odds were already overwhelming. But there was more. With 3 powerful masters like in Lutai, Tu Yin, and Fong Ming on the field, the Iron Guard commander saw no way out. He whispered to the prince that he would try to lead a breakthrough shortly, a desperate plan born of pure loyalty. The prince looked at him, noting that such courage and devotion were rare sights, even after all his years at the Sword Pavilion. Fong Ming watched the scene with a twisted sense of enjoyment, savoring the look of despair he expected to see in the 6th prince's eyes. And Lutai was clearly growing impatient, asking if the prince had any last words before he finally met his end. He warned that they shouldn't waste any more time, as dragging things out might lead to some unexpected complications. With a sharp glance at Fong Ming, and Lutai directly raised his heavy horse-slaying blade into the air. The warriors of Achelambu followed suit, letting out a roar as 1,500 Northern Alliance cavalrymen raised their curved sabers. Their blades pointed directly at the 800 Iron Guards, and Fong Ming, not wanting to be left out, raised his spear. The commander, Shiluanu, stepped in front of the prince, his expression becoming incredibly solemn as the pressure mounted. He vowed to carve out a path of blood for his master, but the prince simply smiled, noting the enemy's numbers. He remarked that they were nothing but a pack of useless cowards before dismounting and walking calmly toward Fong Ming. To the prince, Lutai was a hateful figure, a man who had dared to lead an invasion into their lands. The atrocities committed against the people of Great Song were unforgivable, and Tu Yin was just as loathsome. Instead of serving the front lines, these soldiers had turned their whips against their own, attempting to assassinate a prince. In that moment, sharp shadows of sword intent began to radiate from him, even though the 7-star dragon abyss remained sheathed. He had become a peerless blade himself, prompting a panicked Fong Ming to scream for his men to kill him. Tu Yin reacted instantly to the command, leading 500 border troops in a desperate charge toward the prince. And Lutai didn't stay idle either, signaling his 1,500 Northern Alliance troops to launch their own fierce assault. Seeing the onslaught, Shiluanu and Peng Yixing didn't hesitate for a second, leading their men forward to meet the threat. The 800 Iron Guards surged past the prince's figure, and with a deafening roar, the two forces finally collided. In an instant, horses were overturned and men were thrown as the brutal, bloody slaughter truly began. With 1 8th Realm Master and 2 7th Realm Warriors leading the charge, the pressure on the Iron Guard was absolute. Every second, another Iron Guard fell in a gruesome death, yet the prince seemed strangely detached from the carnage. The prince seemed completely unresponsive to the chaos, continuing his steady walk forward, and with every single step he took, the sword intent radiating from his body grew even more powerful, a detail in Lutai was watching very closely. Suddenly, the commander felt a strange sensation at his waist, and when he looked down to investigate, he noticed the long sword hanging there was vibrating with a low, humming sound, and he wasn't the only one. Every warrior nearby who carried a blade felt their weapon becoming uncontrollable, reacting to a Grandmaster's sword intent. Fong Ming's face twisted in shock, realizing the sword intent coming from the prince far exceeded the limits of a 7th Realm warrior. He screamed for Tu Yin and in Lutai to kill Li Xianbai immediately, sensing the growing danger. He realized the prince was using this walk to build his momentum, and hearing this, the two commanders charged toward him. And Lutai let out a cold sneer, thinking that Grandmaster intent meant nothing if the boy lacked the actual strength of a Grandmaster. He was certain the prince was still destined to die, but the prince only offered a faint, knowing smile in response. He knew that the power of the 7th Realm was indeed insufficient for a moment like this. However, in the very next second, the full force of the 8th Realm suddenly erupted from him, a powerful surge of energy that manifested in an instant. This overwhelming power drew the eyes of everyone on the battlefield, and Fong Ming could only stare in utter disbelief. he stammered, asking when the prince could have possibly reached the 8th realm, just as the 7-star dragon abyss cleared its sheath. The entire battlefield began to echo with the sharp, resonant cry of sword chi as it filled the air. At that moment, the Grandmaster-level sword intent was displayed in its full, terrifying glory, leaving the 3 enemies looking grim. They lunged at him simultaneously, their combined strength creating a force that was, to be honest, quite world-shaking. Yet, facing these 3 deadly attacks, the prince remained unbothered, calmly raising the 7-star dragon abyss. He declared that his single sword was meant for killing, and in that split second, the Grandmaster's sword wings lunged forward to strike the 3 of them down. With a deafening explosion, their powers collided, and Enlutai was instantly sent reeling as he coughed up a mouthful of blood. His previous injuries hadn't fully healed, and this impact aggravated them instantly, causing Tu Yan's breathing to become ragged and weak. Of the 3, he was the only true 7th realm warrior, and while Fong Ming's face was pale, he remained in the best condition. His movements weren't hindered yet, but the sheer terror growing in his heart was becoming impossible for him to hide. He realized this blind man's strength had truly reached such a level, and he shouted that they must kill him together or die today. He argued that with the prince's current energy, he couldn't possibly sustain such powerful attacks for long. And with those words, the 2 wounded commanders felt a sudden surge of renewed confidence. Hearing Fong Ming's desperate logic, Li Xianbai gave a silent, cold scoff. He decided to see if they could actually last until his strength ran out, keeping his focus locked entirely on Fong Ming. The 3 of them had grown much smarter this time, avoiding a direct head-on confrontation with the prince's overwhelming power. They intended to simply wear Li Xianbai down, but to be honest, their frantic movements looked almost ridiculous before him. For some reason, Fong Ming felt as though the prince could see through every single one of his moves, no matter how he tried to dodge. He found it impossible to escape the prince's pursuit. By now, he was in a state of utter pathetic desperation as he was hunted down. Even though the prince wasn't repeating his initial massive explosion of power, he gave Fong Ming absolutely no room to breathe. Facing the cornered and panicked Fong Ming, the prince's expression remained calm as he softly announced his next strike, the moon-slaying god. In the moment the shadow fell, his blade carved a path through the air, thrusting forward with violent precision toward Fong Ming. Fong Ming's eyes nearly burst from their sockets as he desperately swung his own sword, trying with all his might to block the incoming strike. With a sharp, metallic crack that echoed across the field, Fong Ming's blade was instantly shattered into pieces. The sword chi pierced straight through Fong Ming's heart, effectively choking back the final words he was trying to scream. He collapsed heavily onto the ground, unable to utter a single sound as the life left his body. And that, as they say, was that. Nearby, Enlutai and Tu Yan watched the scene unfold, their entire bodies trembling with a fear they couldn't suppress. This was especially true when the prince turned to face them, even though his eyes remained closed and sightless. And yet, he projected an endless sense of overwhelming pressure that seemed to weigh down the very air around them. They both understood that there was no longer any path for retreat. Their only hope was to stop him so the army could crush the 800 Iron Guards. Only then could they use the sheer force of the massive army to surround and kill him. This was their final, desperate gamble. It was the only chance for victory they had left. With the wind at his feet, Li Xianbai charged toward the 2 of them. The pair began to move frantically around him, hoping that by staying in constant motion, they might find a way to survive. Through this method, they actually managed to hold their own for a moment, and both men even allowed themselves a small sigh of relief. They truly believed they could keep him occupied indefinitely, but in the next instant, their eyes widened in pure, unfiltered disbelief. We see the prince's eyes, which had been closed this entire time, suddenly snap open with terrifying intent. His blood-red pupils glared at them like those of a bloodthirsty demon god, freezing the very marrow in their bones. Almost in the blink of an eye, he appeared directly in front of Tu Yan, who stared down at the long sword piercing his body. In that final moment, he finally understood why Fong Ming had died so quickly and so easily. After all, who could have imagined that the legendary blind prince wasn't actually blind at all? Tu Yan closed his eyes in bitter resentment as he fell. Watching his comrade die, Enlutai was struck by a wave of pure shock. He reacted instantly, turning to flee as fast as his legs would carry him. Both of his fellow rebel leaders were now dead. Left alone, he knew he couldn't possibly stall the prince. However, he felt a stroke of luck. The delay had already served its purpose. The 800 Iron Guards had already been battered and broken by the relentless pressure of the main army. Realizing this, a twisted grin spread across his face as the sky began to darken almost imperceptibly around them. Enlutai successfully retreated back into the safety of the main army, while the remaining Iron Guards began to rally toward the prince. We see the 500 Iron Guards who originally followed Tu Yan's orders now moving toward Li Xianbai as well. Deep down, these men felt utterly lost and confused. To be honest, their current situation had become incredibly awkward. Previously, they had followed Tu Yan's orders, but now they had lost their central leader and their sense of purpose. They stood there, paralyzed by indecision, unsure if they should still carry out the order to kill the 6th prince. or if they should choose to help him fight these northern barbarians. However, as the three factions separated, the truth became clear. They realized that they were the ones who had suffered the most, with only 30 to 50 men remaining of the original 500. Almost every survivor was covered in horrific wounds. Peng Isin gritted his teeth and began to approach the prince. Behind him were the remnants of the Iron Guard, and to be honest, these 800 men weren't in much better shape. If the sixth prince hadn't intervened when he did, it's likely all 800 of them would have been slaughtered by now. Meanwhile, the Shura slave led the remaining Shura guards to form a defensive circle around the prince's position. Seeing this desperate situation, Enlutai couldn't help but laugh mockingly, shouting that the prince was now truly alone. He claimed no one could help him escape the encirclement of thousands of cavalry, spreading his single arm while clutching his horse-slaying saber. His words were filled with unbridled arrogance, acknowledging that while his own losses were massive, the prize was worth it. To him, the sixth prince was a 15-year-old genius with the sword skills of a master. Killing him would justify any sacrifice. Suddenly, Peng Isin raised his sword high into the air, declaring that today was the day they were prepared to die. He called out to his men, telling them that the moment of their final sacrifice had finally arrived. He swore that as long as a single Iron Guard remained breathing, these northern barbarians wouldn't touch a hair on the prince's head. The soldiers responded with a thunderous roar, a collective cry that seemed to stir the very heavens and earth around them. A sudden crack of thunder erupted from the thick, dark clouds, and we see the prince's expression soften with genuine emotion. Ever since his mother's death, he had viewed the world with the detached perspective of a mere observer. But today, these soldiers willing to die for him allowed him to feel a sense of belonging and acceptance once again. In that moment, the sharp, overwhelming sword intent radiating from his body suddenly vanished as he slowly raised his right hand. As the sound of the Hu flute began to resonate, a piercing scream suddenly tore through the air at that very moment. The twin blades hummed like falling snow, and as more screams followed in rapid succession, Enlutai felt his heart begin to tremble.